All right. Welcome, relatives, for the first in our series of webinars focused on what domestic violence advocates need to know about sexual violence. We are recording this at the end of October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and we have been talking and thinking about what does that really mean for folks who are doing sexual assault work, or for domestic violence advocates who are seeing things as people are coming into shelter or seeking services. And so today, as part of our National Tribal Sexual Assault Resource Center, which is funded under HHS, under the Office of Family Violence Prevention Services, that we were going to have a little conversation today about this. My name is Jolene Engelking, Buju, White Earth, Anishinaabe. I am the coordinator of our Tribal Sexual Assault Resource Center here at the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. And I'm here with my two wonderful colleagues who will be serving as our panelists. I'll have them introduce ourselves and then we'll get into the conversation. Ingrid?
Good afternoon, good day. My name is Ingrid Anderson. I am the National Policy Director for the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. I am honored to work with Jolene in the National Tribal Sexual Assault Resource Center, and it's a privilege to speak with you today about these things.
Say hello, my name is Shayla Beaumont. I'm the Elevate Uplift Coordinator for the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. I am in Montana. I'm an enrolled Chippewa Cree member, but I'm also affiliated with Crow, Grovant, and Assiniboine tribes. And I'm excited to discuss and engage in conversation. Not engage in conversation, but with Jolene and Ingrid.
Yes, and I am really looking forward today. And I find that it's always a little bit good to sometimes name the biases that we hold. And I will name that, I come from an advocacy background, but I was trained under and have only worked at standalone sexual assault programs. And so while I have served on the board of domestic violence shelter and often have had, interactions with folks who have been, at dual or multi-service programs, I have not actually done advocacy in a domestic violence sort of realm. And so I'm really looking forward to kind of hearing from my two colleagues from their experiences, and also really thinking about, as we have been launching and growing this Sexual Assault Resource Center, like, what does that mean? What are the differences when it comes to providing services? What are the differences when it comes to the impact on people, on our relatives, on our communities? And what are those differences and in the terms of the steps that then we need to take, both as those of us who are in, coalition or training work, but also folks who are on the ground and in the community. What are the differences that we need to really be taking into account when we're thinking about the nuances that come with sexual assault? And so I think that, to even just kick us off, like, kind of that simple but kind of loaded question is, what are some of the differences that you two have seen when it comes to domestic violence and sexual violence in your work?
Kind of like the difference, and just like you said, the biases when working in a domestic violence shelter, sometimes that misconception that sexual violence doesn't happen in domestic violence or in an intimate partner relationship. So really, when working and providing advocacy trainings, really educating that sexual assault can happen in a domestic violence situation. And even just like, that widely known misconception that a partner can't be sexually assaulted when they are in a relationship. Sorry, I'm listing ways they overlap, and I'm not really naming the ways they differ. But no, working in domestic violence, and responding to a sexual assault, a lot of times, we see the sexual assault program and the domestic violence program housed under one spot. And with domestic violence, we know our abuser, we're in a relationship with our abuser, but sexual assault, it could be anybody we know. Sometimes it could be somebody we don't know, but there doesn't always have to be that relationship like in the domestic violence issue. When it comes to sexual assault, we might not even have a relationship or even know our perpetrator in a sexual assault versus a abusive relationship.
I think that I remember once so once again, only standalone sexual assault programs, which also there's often sometimes in the communities where they do have, both, standalone sexual assault and standalone domestic violence program, there's often a rub between the two programs. Some of that is coming from a weird form of being territorial, but often it's guided by funding and people who are really wanting to do the best for people in their community, but it can be very hard when funding is having to put you at odds with each other. But I remember one of the domestic violence advocates had told me, they're like, oh yeah, like that's why, sexual assault should fall under domestic violence because, all sexual violence is a form of domestic violence. And to me, that never rang true, right? Because there's so many different ways that sexual violence, happens, the ways that we are perpetrated upon, both from, the child sexual abuse that happens to the full spectrum of sexual assault, sexual violence that includes everything, from sexual harassment, to voyeurism, to the way that our culture just really kind of creates these negative situations, especially for our young boys and girls, to be like early sexualized, and the culture that kind of gets created with that, all the way to the violence and the harm that is done to people. And that is not saying that that's a hierarchy, but there's so many ways that our society is unhealthy in its sexuality and the way that we're talking about it, and the way that the violence is coming about. And so I just keep thinking that there's so much of that, like, yes, within a relationship situation, like within a domestic violence situation, even in relationships that people have told me were healthy, there are still so many things related to sexuality that folks aren't talking about. Like the people who, like, I have friends who are married who say that they have the best marriage and would never say that their spouse is abusive. Will tell me, they'll be like, yeah, I don't want to have sex most of the time, but he wants to, so I just kind of give in all the time. And whether or not that is true sexual violence, people will have their debates on that. But at the same point, like, that's not healthy sexuality, even within a marital situation, right? Let alone the people who feel that, there is no such thing as marital rape, right? Where especially within the confines of a legal marriage, that people have the right to do whatever you want to somebody else. And so it's just very, I don't know, it's hard to navigate and hard to talk about sometimes, because most times people don't want to let those secrets out, those things that are supposed to just, like, what stays in our house, what happens in our house stays in our house, is something that so many of us have heard. So,
and then even just talking about the other forms of sexual violence and sexual assault in domestic violence, or in with sometimes even just manipulating your partner through sexuality, like, oh, you want to use the food stamp card, oh, you want to use the children's insurance cards, being exploited even in that way. But then some might not even look at that as sexual exploitation or sexual assault, just like you said, just kind of what happens in the household, but then that being a healthy relationship.
what about you, Ingrid? I see some thoughts going through your head right now.
I think what we're really talking about is like the commodification of sexuality, both the like the transactional sex act, as well as the value that we associate with our sexuality, that it is something upon which we can trade or operate. Perhaps not even in engaging in a sex act, but feeling like using my sexuality as a tool to either, keep myself safe or to access resources, to maintain safety within a relationship or within a family, it really is an extension of the colonial mindset, right? That instead of being inherently whole and inherently valuable just by virtue of existence, that this is something that that becomes a commodity, both I think within family units, within relationships, and sometimes just in our own relationships with ourselves. And to get back to Jolene's introductory kind of self-disclosure of biases, I will freely acknowledge that I've been in direct service for the majority of my life, and most recently came from a prosecutor's office. And being in a form of direct service provision that is not advocacy per se, I do acknowledge that the like even in assisting victims through the prosecutorial process, we see that continued commodification of sexuality in the way that a victim presents, in the way that they engage with the system, like needing to come across in a certain way to appeal to the judge, to appeal to the jury, to appeal to the prosecutor, to maybe feel worthy to come to law enforcement. I feel is helped me to see that there are so many ways that victims and survivors of sexual violence are not seen as valuable just because of who they are and what they've been through. Like, I can't be seen, or I don't want to leave the house because I look like such a mess, or I want to get cleaned up before I talk to the police. Really just indicates that we are not doing a good job of creating space for the whole individual in both being able to disclose as well as being able to access services, access services, access law enforcement resources, etc.
And I think so, kind of going along with that, when we're thinking about, so the reason some of the part of this webinar series kind of came up is because we all work with, communities all across the country, and I both in like tribal and non-tribal kind of spaces, folks keep being like, we're having a conversation, we're having a training on sexual assault, and they keep bringing it back to domestic violence. All of the situations they talk about, all the questions they have are all really stemming from domestic violence. And when I've asked folks, like why is it harder to to focus on the sexual assault? Some people it's because they're like, we don't see it very often, like, and that's not saying that it's not happening in their communities, but that's not who is actually walking through their door, calling their hotlines, accessing any form of services. And also I've seen that both from in all different from advocacy to law enforcement to prosecution, people still have a hard time talking about sex, about the sex part of sexual assault, right? About that intimacy that comes with things. And so for me, like when I'm thinking about, I want to really just help and support dual and multi-service, programs. So both, domestic violence and sexual assault advocates, as well as those who do other things like general crime or have like housing programs, things like that. Feel comfortable, because people want to do a good job. Like, all of these advocates have such great hearts, right? I very rarely met an advocate where I'm like, oh, I don't really kind of trust where you're coming from with that, right? Most of the time people want to do good, but they are either worried that they're going to cause more harm, they have their own things that they need to work through when it comes to the sexual assault, or they think it's easier to, if we have one person who's like very specialized, in this, that it's better for people. Like, so that's the way that they'll get the best services that they can have. And I just see it where there's so many programs then that, I don't know, both in terms of their outreach to community and how they're marketing themselves, as well as like when people walk through the door, you're not really creating that culture that's like conducive to people having, to disclosing the sexual assault, right? And especially because with domestic violence, often people are focused on very, very tangible things. Like we have action steps, we have safety planning, we have this, we have that. And that sometimes then there's not really the space for people to talk about the sexual harm that has been done, both, either in that moment, like within that domestic violence situation, or within their past, which is maybe influencing why they might not want to talk to law enforcement, or why they might have be behaving in this sort of way, right? And so just trying to kind of like balance all these sorts of things and help to equip advocates like with the skills and the knowledge that they need. So
yes, and then definitely highlighting, sometimes thinking of 24-hour, like 24/7 crisis lines, or 24/7 services that are accessible during that time for a sexual assault. Maybe that is the domestic violence shelter, the domestic violence services in that area. And I'm also kind of speaking mainly from a rural standpoint too, just from a lot of times our services are housed under, I live very rural in Montana, so that's why I'm saying are. In Montana, in a rural setting, a lot of our programs and a lot of our services are housed under one location, or like under one big location, or under one program, or under one grant. And so how do we, like prepare or offer the training or getting our advocates comfortable, so we don't hear, well, I'm not, my training was in domestic violence, not sexual assault, or even sexual violence or trafficking or some form of sexual violence. But and really working with what we have, we hear like in rural settings, lack of resources, but like really, how do we empower to work with what we have instead of looking at it as lack of, but better of empower? And I really think like strength, sexual assault services being turned away, like that's not our wheelhouse or that's not what we have training in, but how do we strengthen that? Because sometimes that's really what we are left with. And being really clear about the services we do offer. Like maybe we do have a sexual assault funding or a position that is written into their position, but it's just not known, it's not talked about. Maybe leadership didn't highlight that in the protocols or the training, but really highlighting how that's overlooked. And maybe it isn't written into our grant or our funding specifically, but I mean, it is a form of violence. So really empowering to work with what we do have. And I keep speaking from a rural setting too. So I want to add that.
Well, I think, Shayla, what you're talking about too is that skill differential between what is expected or commonly performed as part of a domestic violence advocate's responsibilities or duties, both within the community and within an organization, versus, what a specialized sexual violence advocate's responsibilities could look like. And I wonder if part of why there is a gap between what's needed and what's being offered in so many of our communities is because it does require a different outlook, a different modality of response. Like Jolene referred to, like there might not be as many like tangible tasks to complete for a survivor of sexual violence as there might be for a survivor of domestic violence, just depending on how one is presenting or what a survivor is bringing to the advocate. But also I wonder, what does that conversation look like or sound like when a survivor presents, in having come out of domestic violence and, perhaps over the process of time begins to disclose a history of sexual abuse, a history of sexual violence, perhaps, earlier in life or even as a child. And I just have been thinking about what those skills, what skills are really called for in that conversation, because I think that it can often blindside folks in advocacy positions thinking, okay, we're dealing with domestic violence, we're dealing with DV. That's the name of our shelter. That's the name of our program. That's what we do. This is, what we have support groups around. These are the services that we're able to provide at a very high level. And in terms of equity and access, then how are we able to provide the same, robust, comprehensive level of service to people who are then disclosing sexual violence? Because it's not the same. The responses are not, the disclosures or demand a different response, and an often, very nuanced response from advocates. And from Jolene, your work in standalone sexual violence programs, what do you feel can kind of speak to that differential of skill and response?
And that's where I've even been getting stuck. Is like, honestly, even I was an advocate. I was trained as an advocate 18 years ago, right? And sometimes and I've been doing this national training and TA work for 8-9 years now at this point, and sometimes it's still hard to really succinctly kind of say what are those differences. What I've seen sometimes is that sexual assault advocates have to sit a lot more with folks who want to not engage with any parts of the system, right? Not that most domestic violence survivors want to, right? But often I've seen sexual violence, people, sometimes it's just those one-off calls that we're getting a lot of the time, but really it's sitting with a lot of unknown and sometimes just holding space for people. Because often, like, most of the sexual assault survivors that I worked with, they're not necessarily needing, new locks on their doors or things like that, which occasionally that does happen, right? There are very tangible things that survivors still need of sexual violence. But at the same point, a lot of it was just being in a relationship, having somebody to sit there and to smudge with, and somebody who they can just call, right? Where we're not really, it sometimes feels like you're not doing anything, but you are, right? You're doing the most human thing that you can be, which is creating that space for somebody. We're not trying to be therapists, right? Like, we're not trying to diagnose people. We're not trying to fix survivors, right? And I think that that's one of the things, is that, like, sexual assault survivors, it can be a long process for folks to really heal from, particularly because, there's often so much violence that's happened across the lifespan. And so for some people, for most people who I worked with, this was just like one instance and so you're not just dealing with that moment, you're dealing with the totality of their life, right? And when you're thinking about, like, the intimate harm that can be done, we previously did a webinar, fully on, sexual health and healthy sexuality, and what is that impact, and how the sexual harm that can be done can really just, it changes the way that you look at yourself, your body, your relationship to spirit, to creator. You're even feeling the unworthy to participate in ceremony, right? And all these sorts of things that kind of come with it. And not that doesn't ever happen in domestic violence, but I've just seen it more heightened. And so that's like, there's differences, obviously, like in some of, like, the real ways. But also some of it's just like, the focus is often more on that, like, longer term healing, where I've known so many people who've worked with folks for, 1 to 5, 15 years, through the same program, just because they need somebody to kind of help with them at those different points. And yes, you're seeing a lot more people in that kind of crisis stage, with the hospital accompaniment and law enforcement and things like that. But so often what we do is sexual assault advocates is, I don't know, we just kind of walk with them through these spaces. And so I think that, to me, is like, but that can be really hard, because I see so many domestic violence advocates who just because of the nature of the work, because of the crisis nature, they problem solve so beautifully, right? But sometimes there's not a problem to be solved. And so often, I mean, when people talk about people who've experienced sexual violence and who've had harm done to them like that, I often hear people use language like, they're broken, they can never be the same again, and all these sorts of things. And I'm just like, oh, if this is how we're entering into space, if we're viewing somebody as, you were sexually assaulted as a child, or you were, raped as an adult, that means that you are permanently broken. And I'm like, if that's like, no, because we're not problems to be solved. We're not fully broken all the time. And people may feel that way. That may be the individual's experience, right? But if that's the lens that we're working with everybody through, I think that is doing a disservice to all of our relatives who are coming through the door, right? Or who aren't coming through the door, because they may feel the same. If that's a narrative that we're kind of putting out there, why would anybody, they're like, I can't be fixed anyway, so why would I even want to go and be vulnerable in this other situation? And so I think that level of vulnerability and the longer term healing process, and also, like, the difference in the justice system when it comes down to it, often with things not being, typically with a lot of sexual assaults being felony level, it can often be harder to charge. And what does justice and safety really look like in those situations? So
I really liked how you phrased that, Jolene, like the space and the narrative that we're going into this work with. And with what Ingrid asked, I was really thinking, healing, really focusing on that wholeness of our survivor and letting them lead us through this process, instead of, just like you said, like, beautifully wanting to be action planning and wanting to check a box, but really it's not always like that. And really being trauma informed and understanding language and how powerful that is, and trauma informed, and being like the wholeness of the person. Maybe all we did today was get through breathing, but that is a lot. That is huge amount of work. Don't worry that we didn't get housing applications done. Don't worry that she doesn't have a therapist. Don't worry that she doesn't have a job yet. Like, no, we did huge work today for her spirituality, her mental health. And then when you mentioned, like, going into these spaces, and I understand, like, funding, it is a huge issue. It's bigger than our and being meaningful with our time, but then going back to that trauma informed piece. Yes, we want to see as many people as we can. We want to get as much stuff done as we can, but realistically and healingly, that's not how advocacy to meaningful work, like that's not how we can't have our the headspace be in. And really, and like when we do open that space, when we have like what qualifies this victim for our services. So instead of like, oh well, you didn't mention that you're in a harmful space, so you can't sit in here, when really it's like maybe they just want to come speak their truth. Healing and justice looks different. Maybe they don't want to do that report. But then going back to, is this the space that we are creating?
And I appreciate that you kind of brought that back to like the intimacy of sexual assault. And Shayla, earlier you mentioned the secrecy and like what happens in this house or what happens in this family or whatever stays here. And I wonder if, that sense of secrecy or intimacy or, whichever word with whatever connotation you want to use, best fits maybe the scenario you're thinking of. I think that really also speaks to the power, then the healing power of just bearing witness to another person's experience, that to break down that like shroud of secrecy and shame and isolation, all of these things that come from the way that our society responds or refuses to respond to sexual violence in all of its forms, I think is perhaps the biggest source of power, especially for both Indigenous women and Indigenous folks serving Indigenous communities. Like these are unique experiences across a very unique whole lived experience lifespan that we can bear witness to, because we often do understand the maybe historical context of these acts of violence. We can understand what it means to feel disconnected from ceremony, to be spiritually disconnected, within our own community, and then how that extends into feeling, isolated from our relatives and isolated from our sense of self. These things that maybe we grew up thinking were our source of power and our source of safety perhaps have become the weapons used against us, the weapons that have been used to violate us. And I wonder if maybe that is the source of power, and that's the upskill between a domestic violence advocacy response and a sexual violence advocacy response, is being willing to see the value and power in sitting with, being with, holding space for, bearing witness to the experiences of our relatives in these very, in a very sacred way that then breaks down the shame. And we know that shame is a tool of the colonizer. The shame even around one's own body, one's own healthy sexuality, all of those things that so many of us have internalized, or our parents or grandparents did internalize, through that assimilation process. And I feel, even in working with the two of you, that your ability to bear witness just to the experience of, your colleagues, often as Indigenous women, helps to break that down. And we're not even talking about the violent experiences or, perhaps criminal acts that we've experienced or heard that others have survived.
Thank you so much for that, Ingrid. And it also was having me think about, like, what are some of those other differences? And the one thing that we haven't really talked much about today is this idea that sometimes it's harder for sexual violence, survivors to come forward simply because of the heavy amount of shame that people have been either instilled in, since that very young age, right? But also the shame that comes with, the sexual violence that, was done to them. And how often our society, it's not easy for domestic violence survivors to come forward, right? I am definitely not saying that. But sometimes it's easier for people to believe them sometimes. sometimes it's easier because people also want to, like, there's so many people who want to give money, to domestic violence, programs and all these sorts of things. And often then sexual violence is like this like little like sidestep where they don't even want to talk about it. Like I used to do, boothing, when I was an advocate, and people would make this like wide berth around me, right? They'd be stopping at all the other things. And then they're like, oh, sexual assault, and like, just like run away from me basically. And I don't think I'm that scary, but we also provided a very important thing in our community, right? And it was something where like we were out in the community all the time, but people would still say, oh, are you a new program? It's like we were around for 40 years at that point. But because often people don't want to know about programs like that until they need it, right? But the shame that comes, what I was getting with that though, is like this immense level of shame. And there's this blame and culpability that people put upon survivors of sexual violence, right? It's much easier to, say that domestic violence, somebody who's been a victim of domestic violence is more innocent, or, a child who's been sexually abused, they're more innocent. But somebody who, might have been out, drinking, using drugs, and putting themselves in bad situations, they're entirely at fault apparently for their sexual assault, is what people seem to put out there. Or they're made to feel that way, even in the way that people have questions, or the way that like people are like, well, are you really a victim? They question their own, everything down to that core. And so it's also much harder than when we're raised in a society that doesn't talk to us about healthy sexuality, to even know when sexual violence is being done. I used to train advocates, and so often, like almost every advocate training I would do, somebody would come up to me midway through the training and be like, oh, this reminds me of something that happened when I was little, and I never realized that, when my babysitter said this, that this is really what was going on. And so people don't recognize that so much harm has already been done, right? And so if we're not able to like name it, how are we able to then help people when it like after the fact, as well as prevent it, right? So.
And then like just what you were talking about, like rape culture, how much that influences just so much, whether it's the criminal justice system, the scaring our survivors who don't even want to come forward because they know what they might face. But and just like, rape culture is so heavily learned, from adolescents to adults, like the gender roles, how a woman, a girl and a woman, how they are supposed to act around men, expected to act, like interrupting rape culture, but then also acknowledging that how much it does affect our movement, the work we do, the decisions made in cases, the education, like the lack of healthy sex, the lack of healthy sexual education because of rape culture. Yeah, I'm done.
Pardon me, Shayla. And I love the way that you're both talking about, or maybe alluding to the fact that a lot of advocates have adopted some of these, ways of thinking in the way that we approach our work, the way that we speak about even sexual violence. And one, beautiful thing that one of our partners recently brought up was, like, do we believe that we are entitled to a survivor's story? And maybe as part of that, then the way that we approach our work, are we making survivors or victims feel like they have to explain themselves to us? A lot of what I saw in direct service provision with sexual violence survivors was like it wasn't just enough to describe the criminal act or the act of violence, but they often also felt like they had to explain why they were at this certain location, or why they met with this person one-on-one, or, well, I did know that this was a silly thing to do, or so-and-so told me to not do that, but I did it anyway. And there's so many ways I think that we put survivors in a position to feel like they have to like seek permission or justify why they're reaching out for services. Like, well, I knew that was poor choice to make, and so I don't even deserve to access services. There's a lot of ways that we put that on survivors to make them feel like, just like I said before, by virtue of having survived, that they are still in that experience unworthy of accessing our services. It's a lot to unpack. And Shayla, another thing our partners have had recently discussed was these gender norms. So I appreciate you bringing up rape culture. I also just think about the ways that a lot of our Indigenous communities have adopted patriarchal mindsets, both maybe in our tribal codes, our laws, and the law enforcement response, and unfortunately in the way that their advocates respond. Well, that's none of our women would do that, or girls raised in my community would never do that, or be that way. And I wonder what it really looks like to interrupt those things and to have respect and love for our relatives and for our elders and for our young people. And that's really like the source of courage for me, to confront these ways of thinking and these ways of being. I wonder what that looks like in our work.
Feel that is kind of like a good way to almost wrap up this first part of our series, where today we wanted to talk a little bit about like what are the differences and kind of what does the sexual violence victimization really look like. And we know that both sexual and domestic violence advocates do so much amazing work and are doing their absolute best for their communities, for survivors, and really, for culture, right? Particularly within our tribal, communities, because that is part of it. This is heart work, right? In addition to sometimes just being that job that you have to get through. But in future times, we were going to talk more about like diving into some of these things, but like what are some of those like practical things that people are needing? What are some of the services that sexual assault survivors are needing? What could that look like for your organization or your policies or your partnerships? And so I do want to thank my colleagues for being so generous with their time and their heart and their spirit today, as we kind of begin this conversation. Thank you all for being here. Miigwech.
Thank you, Kitatamyan.